Hello, in this video we are going to build an MBR F1 stock car. So I send a lot of base plate sets out to people and then it's not always clear how they are put together. So we're going to go through the complete process from start to finish. So this is a typical base plate set that you'll get from me. It's all CNC cut. This design is from 2018. It's been around a long time. It's had a lot of success. It's won world championships, national championships, club championships. It's fast, it's easy to work on, and it's strong. So the first thing you'll need to do is cut out the GRP pieces. So you can either use a hacksaw or a file and just cut these tabs, but don't try and twist them out because the GRP will delaminate. So always cut the tabs and don't twist them. Once you've cut the tabs out, you should have a base plate like this. You'll notice this is a slightly different color. It's the same material, it's 1.6 millimeters GRP sheet. The difference between this more yellowy color is this has a ultraviolet coating applied to it. It just depends on the material I can get at the time. They're both the same construction. So the first step is to fit the MI5 ball joints into the front beam. So these push in. They should be quite a tight fit, but just to be sure, it's best to just dab a small bit of super glue, just a drop, in between the beam and the ball joint, and then just push it down so it sits flush with the front beam. And once they're in, these should be nice and free. If you get some super glue in between the ball and the cup, I find if you attach this nut to a drill and just spin it round on a screw setting, you'll free up any glue that's got in there. The next step is to fit two 20mm bolts onto the base plate to these two holes. And this is for the front beam to sit on. And we're using standard M3 nuts, not nylon nuts. Get those nice and tight because once they're on, they're difficult to access, as you'll see. The next step is to fit the base plate protector onto the front of the base plate with 3 M3 bolts and 3 nylon nuts. This is a sacrificial part, so it sits on here and it can be replaced as and when it gets damaged, but it stops the front of this base plate getting damaged. Okay, now we're going to fit the front beam onto the base plate. So we need 2 washers, 2 O-rings, and 2 lock nuts. So we're going to put the washers on first. And then the O-rings. So the washers stop the O-rings from being pushed down over the nut. And then the beam should just sit straight on top. So the O-ring here acts as a damper for the front beam. So you see the beam is sitting flat, but it still has enough flex in the O-ring to pivot. So don't squash those nuts down too hard, otherwise the beam won't be able to move. And then we'll just add the lock nuts on top. The next step is to fit the front springs. So these are U3966 Schumacher Superstocks yellow springs. And then we've got 2 20mm bolts, 2 springs, 2 washers, and 2 lock nuts. So you're going to put the spring on first, and then the washer, and the nut. So we've left about 3mm of the screw thread above the nut. The base plate should be pushed, the beam should be pushed down against the base plate, but it should pivot without too much pressure when you push it up. We're going to fit the steering assembly. So we need 2 steering pivots, U3953, 2 front axles, U3954, and here we're using the plastic hub carriers, U3944. You can get an aluminium version of these, but they are, I think they're £35 now. I'm not a huge fan of having to run £35 sets of hub carriers on a stock car, but that's just my opinion. We need 2 25mm bolts to go through these 2 holes here, and 4 lock nuts. So let's get these fitted. as you tighten these, you want the flat to be facing toward the back of the car, because when these get hit from the side, you want this extra bracing here to stop this screw from getting bent over. So now we're going to fit the servo saver and the turnbuckles. So we're using U4254s, so those are the Schumacher ball gripper sockets and the matching ball studs. If you get the Schumacher ones, you want the long spec, not extra long and not short. And 25mm turnbuckles, any will do. These are Schumacher ones again. And this is a core servo saver. It comes pre-assembled, but with the brace, this black brace is on the back. I've moved it to the front because that helps push the steering arms a bit further forward, gives it a nicer angle against the servo. I've pre-assembled these. You want the eye to eye distance to be about 43mm on both, and that will give you about the right amount of toe out. And we're going to use the front holes in these steering blocks. So I've tightened that down and just left a little bit of thread showing on the ball joint. Clip the steering arms on. And just to be clear, this is using the middle holes on the servo saver. The next step is to fit the chassis posts. These are 24mm iStock chassis posts, threaded either end. They come in a pack of 8, but we're only going to fit 7 to begin with. We're using 3mm bolts, and we're going to leave this chassis post hole here. We're not going to put a post in there yet. So next we're going to fit the weight and the lipo holder. So this is a 200-gram laser cut weight. It's got all the holes pre-drilled, and it should just slot straight over the chassis posts. For the lipo holder, we've got two 20mm long, 5mm wide spacers. You can get these off eBay. Well, guess what? I sell them. And we're using 8mm bolts, and we're going to just attach this piece of plastic to this piece of GRP. So the holes are actually keyed. It will only fit one way, but you want this curved bit here against this corner here. When you tighten these, don't over tighten because you'll strip the plastic quite easily. It's only 3D printed. So just do these finger tight. The design of this varies slightly depending on the material. So on the yellower GRP, this piece is actually slightly bigger. So that's the equivalent piece on this design. It just gives you more space to fit weights or receivers or bits for the ESC. With this lighter material, I don't have space on the sheet. The sheet is smaller, so I can't fit this piece on. So we're going to fit these two spaces here into these two holes here with 8mm bolts. And this fits onto these two posts. So part 2 of the lipo holder is this curved piece here. We've got two 20mm spacers and 4 8mm bolts. We're going to use these two holes here. This curved piece sits on here over these two posts. And the final piece of the lipo holder is this little plastic piece here and a 16mm bolt. I'm going to put the bolt through this hole here. And we're going to screw into this plastic piece. And then just to show how this works, if we get a lipo, slides in like this, and then if you tighten this screw, it will push this plastic up against here, up against the lipo, and stops it falling out. If over time this hole strips, there is another hole in this plastic block that you can screw into through here to properly lock this shut. So now we're going to fit the servo to the car. This is just an old cheap servo I use for building cars up and making everything square. I would recommend using a Savox low profile servo like a 1252. These are very popular in the stock cars. They're fast and they're strong. Just using some basic servo posts here. Plastic ones will be fine if you can't get these. On the base plate, we're using these two small slots here, and they just give you a bit of leeway with the servo posts. So the servo sits on the right-hand side of the car. You can use this hole, this is on the center line of the base plate, and you can use that as a guide to line up the spline of the servo. Going to move that slightly to the left. It's about in the center, and then we just screw in the servo saver. So we've got a slight bit of toe out, which is about what we want. So I've just, off camera, I've swapped over the screw for the servo saver. I was using a M3 bolt, but this cheap servo needs a self-tapper, so I've got that in now. It's all lined up nicely. So now we're going to fit the motor blocks. These are CR871 core stock car motor blocks from Schumacher. It's a really nice piece of kit. We're using 4 8mm bolts to mount them. For the small block, you want the recess for the bearing to sit on the outside of the base plate. Now we're fitting the motor block brace, this piece of GOP with two 8mm bolts. So this just stops it keeps the motor blocks nice and square. Without this you'll break bearings. You want the curve to point forwards. So this gives space for the rear shock. Now we're going to fit the rear axle assembly in. So this is a Schumacher rear axle U3946 and Schumacher drive dog U3947. You can actually use two of these if you want, one on either side of the motor blocks. I'm using a Lee Bishop drive hub for the other side. I've got a Lee Bishop gear carrier, 48 tooth spur and two rear bearings. So we'll insert the bearings. Push the axle through. It should slide straight through. Shouldn't be any friction. I'm going to stick this drive dog on the right hand side and just fit a rear wheel. It just stops everything falling out. Okay, and then we're going to fit the gear carrier on the other side. This has got a flange that butts up against the bearing. I'm going to tighten that just with one for now, one screw, and then we're just going to loosen that off so there's just a fraction of a millimetre play in the axle. You can see that, but it just moves from side to side very slightly, and then it should spin without any friction. And we can tighten up the rest of the gear carrier bolt screws. And then we'll fit the spur gear. Put the smaller drive dog on this side. And then we'll just fit another wheel. Okay, and then it should spin freely with a bit of play side to side. The next step is to fit the rear shock and shock mount. So this is a 65mm buggy shock. You can use anything from 65 to 75. Just make sure it's the spring is as light as possible, and it should be nice and smooth. For the servo mount, for the shock mount, this is just a servo post, the same one we used for the steering. We're going to use the closest hole to the motor block, and we want the end of this servo post to sit just proud of the base plate. And then the rear shock just screws into the other end of the servo saver, of the servo post. It should be nice and free. Now we're going to fit the rear shock mount to the top chassis. So this is a CBE top chassis. They're available pre-drilled to fit the MBR base plate. The only holes you may need to drill are two 2.5mm holes in the back of the chassis for the shock holder. So the way to do that, this hole here, this is where your body mount will go, and it should be about in the center of these two holes here. So if you kind of place it, as you can see that, get that hole in the center of these two, and then you can drill through with a 2.5mm drill bit through this hole and this hole into the base plate. And then I'm using two 12mm bolts here to screw this into the chassis. Don't over tighten these, otherwise you'll strip the thread that you're creating in the chassis. So now we're just fitting the rear body mount. This is just a 10mm version of the same standoff space as we used for the LiPo holder. And I've just drilled a hole in it. I'm going to use this hole here. You want the hole to be kind of face up, otherwise it's going to be difficult to get the body clip in. So now it's time to fit the overriders and the side pods to the top chassis. These are some very nice iStocks overriders. These side pods are just made of 6mm plastic. I can sell you a pair, or you can make them yourselves. So the holes for the side pods are 85mm apart. I've just drilled into these with a 2.5mm drill bit, and these 60mm bolts will tap into the side pod. Just going to fit the final chassis spacer here. Now we've got the servo in. So the next step will be to mount the top chassis onto the rest of the car. But what you'll notice is the steering arms will just foul the top chassis. So we're going to just take this chassis out. We're just going to Dremel away just a section of this cross brace. Still plenty of strength in the chassis after we've done this. Okay, so I've just Dremeled some of the top chassis away. Haven't gone crazy. Just enough so that the steering arms clear the top chassis. Then we're going to use 8 16mm bolts to attach the top chassis to the rest of the car. We'll actually save these last two because we need to fit the front body mount. So for the front body mount, we're using the final piece of GRP. This is another one of the LiPo holder spacers. And we're just going to use an 8mm bolt through here. And two 16mm bolts to screw this to this car. So let's fit some wheels, front wheels. You need 2 bearings per wheel. These are just regular bearings, they're not ceramic. I don't think it's worth the money. You do want the non-rubber bearings. They tend to clog up with dust. You can see we've got clearance now for that front suspension by dremeling out the top chassis. And the final step is to just mount this this rear shock onto the top chassis. So I've got a 25mm M3 bolt. The hole you use will depend on how long your shock is. Basically, the base plate should be able to kind of droop down at least 2mm. So we're going to use this middle nut here to space the shock absorber outwards. So hopefully you can see that the the base plate's able to just droop slightly. And when you put the car on a flat surface, the weight should push it to about level. Got some nice smooth suspension front and back. And that is a finished rolling chassis ready for your electrics and body shell.